Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Corey Pierce, and I'm the Marketing Director at Churn Zero, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar titled, How to Build Effective Customer Success Plans. Before we get started, I'd like to remind you that we are recording this session. A link to the recording will be available 24 hours after the webinar. Throughout the presentation, you are welcome to submit your questions via the question and answer box, and our staff will try and answer them as we go. We will also address as many questions as we can during the Q&A portion of the webinar. Now, I'm pleased to introduce to you our presenter today, Jackie Golden. Jackie has over 20 years of experience in the high-tech industry and has become the go-to person for building the ultimate customer success model. She is an author, speaker, and executive coach with a background that includes some of the top software companies. She founded her own company, LandNExpand, in 2014. She has a passion for building a company-wide customer-centric approach for her clients' business strategies. She recently published a book called Green to Golden, which is about customer success that produces real ROI. I'd recommend checking it out. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Jackie.
Thanks, Corey. I appreciate it. And thank you for having me. So welcome, everyone. So we're going to spend some time today walking you through the framework I use to help my clients build an effective customer success plan. So I'll just kind of walk you through what I'm going to take you through. There is a basic framework, so I just want to share that with you so you know the elements within that framework that I start with. Then we'll get into the roadmap, and that roadmap is really the key. Without a true customer roadmap, you really can't build an effective customer success plan. So I'm going to take some time to share the elements of that. Then we'll get into a few examples of a customer success plan off of a roadmap, and we'll talk a little bit about how that's an evolving type of a roadmap. So it's something you're going to continue to evolve over time, and we'll talk a little bit about how to do that. So getting into the framework should consist of a life cycle management approach. So I call it a CLM model. And I think when we go through that together, it all makes sense. And I'm sure a lot of you are already working with something along those lines. And it has a roadmap, and then it has the customer success plans that are built off of that. And this is really in a logical order of how you would approach building a customer success plan. So here's the framework. It does start with that customer lifecycle model in the top left that you see in a circular motion. These elements, this is just a sample. These elements can be anything, but most companies that say we are customer centric, they start by building some sense of a customer lifecycle model, and they focus in on a target market or whatever target markets are identified in their go-to-market strategy. And out of that, for each target market, they're developing, okay, so if these are the high value problems we're going after, here's the high value outcomes we have to deliver that solve those problems. And from there, you're able to then build the roadmap. How do we do that? How do we consistently, 10 out of 10 customers deliver on those high value outcomes for this target market? What does it take to do that? And from there, you can then develop your tactical customer success plans to say, what do we need to do to keep our customers on the roadmap, focused on the high value problems and delivering real value and ROI over time? So those are the elements to the framework that I work with, and this is how I help all of my clients develop really effective plans. So as we get into it, let's start just with the idea of a customer lifecycle model. The point of that lifecycle model is to create a customer experience. That's the business we're in, is creating that ultimate customer experience where, from a value perspective, so this is from the customer's perspective, the benefits they get are outweighing the costs that they're spending. Most people will be highly motivated when they see that the benefits will outweigh the costs. And keep in mind, costs can be both time, productivity, as well as hard dollars. They can be a variety of things that cost them something in order to get to those benefits. And that's the idea, is create an experience where always the benefits are outweighing the costs. And customers, and in all the customers I talk to, and even if I think about, years ago, they all have this same value expectations. If I invest my time, money, and resources into your solution or your roadmap, I expect the outcomes to produce real values and ROI. I'm hoping you're going to help me get my business where all the numbers are going up and to the right. And so that's really as simple as it is. It has to pay for itself, so to speak, over time, or there has to be a real solid business case for them to continue to invest. So when you're building your customer lifecycle model, it's got to be in the heart of how you look at it from a customer perspective. And with that, one of the first things I do help a lot of my customers to understand is customer success is a company-wide strategy. It's not a department strategy. It's not build a customer success team and here, you go make my customer base, expand and have high retention rates, et cetera. It is a company-wide approach because the execution of a customer lifecycle model is collaborative across all the organizations. Everybody has a play. Everybody will be on the front lines or contributing to content and product and service that actually creates those outcomes that you're looking for, that you can create 10 out of 10 customers to realize those outcomes. So it is a purposeful approach to being customer centric. So when you look at your customer lifecycle model, these are some of the questions I put up when any one of my clients, after we've built a more customized customer lifecycle model for them, we answer these questions. We make sure that we understand what problems we're solving, and not just tactical problems, but high value problems, things that actually can deliver true ROI for them long term. What will they pay for it? What kind of outcomes do we have to deliver that actually solve the problems? How do we know we're making an impact? Do we have a mechanism for not just getting customer feedback, but validating that we are making a transformation in their company, that we are a partner with them, helping them to figure out how to grow profitably and how to increase their revenue and or reduce costs to create those long-term ROIs. And one of the things I want you to notice here is that all of the organizations are represented, the basics anyway. If you think about marketing, sales, services, product, and finance, these are all the organizations that have a play and or might even be the quarterback in different segments of your customer lifecycle model. So it is a highly collaborative approach to being customer centric and for you to actually figure out for each target market what those problems are you're solving, how you're going to solve them, and what specific outcomes do you have to deliver in order to generate either cost reductions, enabling revenue increase, and or the results being highly profitable down the road. So one of the things we talk a lot about is the role of the CSM, because so many of my clients think I hired a CSM team, they're responsible for making our customers happy or successful. I try to help them to understand there is that with that collaborative approach, their role is really to be a consultant. So once you build this roadmap that we're going to talk about, they are the consultants that guide the customer along that roadmap. They're proactively managing to those outcomes and making sure they're being realized, and that every touch point and type of touch point that they design in the plan is to deliver something very valuable along that roadmap. It's being intentional and highly consistent with the customer on keeping them on track to the roadmap. Customers will always deter you. They will squirrel you to death. And the real focus has to always be is I understand, I'm going to make sure that we handle all of the tactics and all of the issues and all of your concerns, but in the line of basically delivering on those high value outcomes on the roadmap. So we never want to lose sight of what we're trying to deliver for the customer and advising and guiding and pulling them back towards the high value outcomes and solving higher value problems. So let's get into talking a little bit about this roadmap. Why is a roadmap important? The ultimate, idea is when you present a roadmap, you're presenting a vision. So a lot of times in the sales cycle, sales has already set the vision and they're buying because they bought that vision. They're like, great, if you can do that for me, I'm all in. The next part becomes more difficult, which is meeting the customer where they're at and developing this roadmap and getting them on board with how you're going to get them from where they are right now to that vision with a step-by-step approach or a phase or stage-by-stage approach. And what you're doing is helping the customer get super comfortable with, okay, I'm in, I get it. I get what I have to do. I get what you're going to do, how you're going to help us over time, following this roadmap, deliver on these outcomes. And it becomes this advisor type relationship, something the customer can come to you for advice on what other things are going on. And again, it allows for when the business changes, markets change. And keep in mind, we're going to go through this a little bit, but companies are in different maturity states. And that needs to be a part of the roadmap, because you might have to help the customer do some transformations in order for them to take advantage of the technology in a much more productive way. And over time, when you get this roadmap really working and finding those sweet spots, you will get to a point where you can actually predict the outcomes of your customers, and renewals start to just happen. And what you're really focused on is the next phase, which creates this more natural, organic expansion process for the customers. So one of the things I really want people to understand when you get to this point is you don't just jump into a success plan, because that just becomes tactics without a vision and without an end game in mind. So keep in mind that your roadmap is really the guide to your tactics to help a customer get to the vision. That's what we're going to focus on here in this next section. I want to share with you first all the elements in a roadmap, because there's more than just one thing. It's not just a plan, even though when you start to look at it, you might think, well, it just looks like a plan. In essence, it is. But there are lots of elements that you have to consider in putting this plan together. We talked about it from the very beginning, right? Are we focused on high value problems such that we can design high value outcomes that actually create real value and ROI for the customer for a particular target market? So being focused really helps you to do that. Again, these values that you create can be multiple values that turn into an ROI. Some solutions offer ROIs kind of out the gate. Some solutions you have to create multiple values that then turn into a hard ROI. There's a maturity model. We'll talk about that a bit more. And the product to customer outcome, there are always these gaps that a lot of solutions have. There's product that's, ready, shelfware. Think about Slack. It's not hard for somebody to figure out the value of Slack for them to optimize their productivity in some way, or communication plans, things like that. But not all products are that intuitive. And the bigger the gap for them to figure it out, we're going to talk about what you have to do to help close that gap. And then time to value is also still something we have to think about, that's got to be included. Complexity factors and engagement entrenchment factors we'll get into, but they're all a part of developing the proper roadmap, and you have to take all of these into consideration as you develop it. So let's look at the first one, right? We have a target market, and if for some reason you're in a company where they're all things to all people, and you're trying to figure out where are we focusing, using that customer lifecycle model and your go-to-market plan, developing that with a team will help you to focus in. But you do need to focus in on what's your target market in order for you to then say, what are the high value problems our solution solves? From that, you should be able to develop high value outcomes. I gave you an example here. I won't go through it in a ton of detail, but the idea is you might have a problem like your product release cycles are too long, and you need to get that down to 30 days or less, 2 weeks or less, or 1 week. And so your value is we reduce product release cycle times by 30%. And then from there, you can start to say, okay, what kind of high value outcomes do we have to deliver that will enable them to be able to reduce their product release cycle by 30%. And then there's a few other examples here as well to show you how you might step through that process of identifying your high value problems and those outcomes and the kind of values that they could create that turns into ROIs. So let's talk about ROIs for a quick second. everybody knows usually what an ROI is, right? It's hard cost savings. It enables revenue, true revenue dollars improvements, and or true improvements in bottom line profitability. So if we think about our value outcomes, right, they should turn into ROIs. So if we look at the example that I just gave you, reduce product release cycle by 30 days, an ROI could be that if they are able to do that within a year, I have some clients who actually have been able to increase revenue between 10 and 25%. And so if you can create that kind of outcomes, those over time, you should be able to get response back from your customer that says, yeah, at the end of the year, we were actually able to improve our revenues by 20% because we had more product to sell before the end of the year. Another example that I gave you previously was about increasing engineering productivity by 20%. There's a lot of high growth companies out there where trying to create profitability somewhere in their 3 to 5 year plan is very challenging. And the number one cost line is headcount. So if for some reason they're off their numbers, they usually have to start holding back on either hiring and or thinking about reducing headcount. So if you can increase the productivity of a team, you could get to a hard ROI like saving hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I've even had clients that have gotten that close to $1 million in savings as they've been able to increase productivity of their teams across their organizations. So this is really what you're trying to identify and define as part of your roadmap. So maturity models are the next thing you have to look at. And I just gave you an example of customer experience maturity model, but what you do need to know is every industry should have a maturity model. And the more complex the problems are that you're trying to solve, usually the more complex your maturity models are. For example, at Socrata, which is a company I was working for recently, they are in government, and I helped them create a digital government maturity model. But we started with like a basic maturity model of open data and then went to something like digital government. So you can look out online, you might see them online. Gartner, Forrester, some of them actually develop these maturity models as part of their assessment of a particular target market or an industry area. But use these because customers love these. When you put them up on the screen, customers immediately start trying to identify themselves and say, oh, wow, I think, yeah, you know what, we're really in this ad hoc. We're just kind of all over the place. We don't really have ourselves organized. We're not really standardizing on anything. I don't even know if we're really aware of what we're trying to do and being intentional about anything. But the idea of a maturity model is it takes a customer through these levels of going from kind of mom and pop shop startup mentality to being aware of what they're trying to do, being focused and being more intentional, creating standards, creating policies, creating goals, collecting data, starting to analyze that data, starting to really understand what's working and what's not, and then getting to that highly predictive state. So you have to consider maturity models as part of your roadmap. So this is how they're used. We assess where they are today. We define the next level of where they should go. So if you identify them that they're at the aware stage and the next logical stage for them would be repeatable, you're building that into your roadmap plan. And if for your technology, in order for them to really enable it, they have to be at a certain maturity state for it to be really effective, this will help you to understand that. And it also helps marketing to understand, okay, we're targeting the wrong customers in this market. Now that we understand better where we play and where our sweet spot is, I'm going to go target more mature companies. So this can really help you as a company get to a point where who you're targeting, who you're selling to, who you're implementing to are really in the sweet spot of what you offer, and you can create more success more consistently over time. So the next element is about this gap. I call it mind the gap. It's really the difference between a product that is shelfware, like I said, out of the box, you get it, the customers get it, and the customers on their own can figure out the value to them. And they can justify that value on their own. There's not much of a lift required except for maybe the support line if something's going wrong. But other solutions are tackling more complex problems and maybe even introducing new concepts, new ways of doing business to optimize their business. And it just may not be intuitive out of the box. So then you have to think about, well, what is it going to take to help our customers understand how to enable this technology? And that might take an education type program. It might take some consulting type programs. Support is usually always there. And then there's a whole nother element, which is the online self-help center. And that's for customers that really want to do things on their own. And so you have to understand what that gap is, because it needs to come into the roadmap. Remember, the roadmap isn't just what customer success does. A roadmap literally says, how do I introduce to a customer or prospect this concept and literally have them see us as the valid solution for these high value problems? And then how am I going to take the customer through that? And what's the roadmap look like? So that step-by-step plan is going to include whatever types of services that you have to do to help support them, from an onboarding to a next phase and ongoing, to get one value outcome to another value outcome to the next value outcome, including now what next. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I want you to understand the importance of this, because as a CSM, part of your job in developing and managing this roadmap is to help plug the customers into these services. So now that you know how these services play and the value they have to the customer, part of your roadmap and your guidance and your advisory role is to help plug them in, to make them as knowledgeable and as independent as possible. Most customers don't want to have to make a phone call every time they need help on something. So if they can get to a quick resource and solve the problem themselves, that is usually, almost all the customer interviews I've done, that's usually their first go-to, especially in this day and age. They would love to solve it themselves, and if they can do it in a quick enough period of time, they will. So that's one of the key elements you want to keep in mind in developing this roadmap. The other aspect of it is time to value. The roadmaps still have to provide value in short periods of time. Customers are not as patient today as they were 10, 15 years ago, where they kind of expected, hey, I'm doing a SAP implementation and I know this is going to take 5 years, or I'm going to do a big CPM implementation and I know it's going to take me a year and a half. In today's world, they're expecting value out the gate and continuous value over time. And what my biggest guidance to a lot of my clients is chunk it up. Create high value outcomes in shorter periods of time and phase it. It gets them hooked, and then it keeps them hooked. And you're giving them one outcome after another, so it keeps them hooked. They're seeing the changes. It allows them the time to do transformations if that's what's required. And they're still seeing the ROIs over time. So that's still really important to keep in mind. What is that time frame that your roadmap is going to be delivering value? And then you do have to consider a complexity factor. Some roadmaps can be short and sweet and pretty easy. Others take a little bit more time and complexity, because the maturity levels required might take a little bit more time. Transformations might be more complex on the people and process side. There might be a higher level of education and an ongoing education over time to get customers to realize those outcomes and really get to a point where it's turning into an ROI for them. So the way I explain it to people is, the bigger that gap that we just talked about, usually the higher the complexity factor. So for example, if I'm in a particular target market, and in that target market, I'm talking to, I'm specifically looking at the enterprise segment, that complexity factor might be a 4 out of 5, versus if my product actually works really well for an SMB market or lower end mid market, and it really requires less, and we kind of have a solution that's a little more out of the box, a very, very lightweight lift. My complexity factor might be a 2 or a 3 out of 5. So you want to identify and try to make sure you understand each of your markets and the complexity factors, and take that into consideration as you build your roadmap. And then obviously every CSM, has a customer base. Almost every time you start into a company, there's a set of customers. So how do you assess that? And you do want to take that into consideration in building your roadmap, because you're going to have customers at all different stages in your current customer base, plus what you're going to do as you onboard new customers. So your plan still has to take into account that I have existing customers and they're all in different places. So assessing them, and I know you all know red, yellow, green, and you might be using a CRM system, something along those lines today, to help you create a health score that's evaluating them. However, I'm going to challenge you to look at it, into one more in-depth perception, and that is, how engaged are they? So you do have some metrics on how maybe it's being adopted across the organizations that you've sold it into, and for what purposes. The indispensability is how much are you attached to those high value critical areas of the business. So having a ton of engagement but not a lot of indispensability will still not get you to a green or a golden state with that customer. Thus, the reverse is, if it is part of a critical element but a very, very small area, it still might be in a highly replaceable position. So you want to get them to the green, you want to keep them in the green, but that the roadmap needs to help customers who are in the red figure out how to get to the green, who are in the yellow, how to get to the green. The green really is where you're creating value, those valuable outcomes. To flip it into the golden state is really when those value outcomes actually are producing hard ROIs, and it already has a business use case for why they should renew and why they want to continue to expand. And you'll see that in these plans that we put that I'm going to show you a little bit later on how the roadmap continues. It's an ongoing roadmap that really kind of never ends for your customers in order to keep them on board with your technology as part of their growth plan long term. So let's get into the success plans here, and share a little bit of what I've done off of a roadmap. So the idea is, remember, we started with the life cycle model, we then built this roadmap, and now that we have a roadmap, we're going to develop customer success plans that help us enable and deliver on that roadmap over time. It should all still be within that customer lifecycle model, meaning the type of experience that you need to create long term. So what I usually do is start with a summary level plan. So this is usually how I would whiteboard the beginnings of a customer success plan off of a roadmap. So if we have a roadmap and plan in place, we know the problems and we know the outcomes for that target market, we start to then look at the segments. So this is an example at the top of looking at an enterprise segment for a particular, so the TM1 is target market 1. Again, this is dumbed down. It's not an actual plan for one of my customers, so I've stripped out a lot and just made it a bit more generic. But you'll get the idea of what you would then put into this. Across the top is your customer lifecycle stages. So again, I dumbed this down to make it pretty simple. In this example, there's just 4 stages. There's acquire, there's implement, there's engage, and there's value. And then down the side are the different processes. So you have, remember we talked about customers in different states. So initiate is a new customer. How am I going to onboard a new customer and go through our customer lifecycle stages? The next one is, how would I manage a customer, an existing customer, going through the lifecycle stages? And then what happens at expansion when we're ready to move on? We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then obviously in the end, because I'm creating tremendous value and ROI, I'm having different levels of referenceability for those customers that I also want to maintain. And at the bottom is, if I did in that target market have a play in mid-market or small biz, it would probably be, usually it's a, let's just say, a lesser version of the full product, and or in some cases it might be a very specific part of the product or a module in the product that really creates high value for that market. So we have a play in a high value problem that we solve easily. And this is something we can do in a tech touch. And so this would be, what would be the key elements that I would need to put in place for each of our customer life cycles for a tech touch? And then keeping in mind, what are some of the things that we would do to keep our communication wide open between us and the customer? So this just is a nice way to lay out how you are thinking about each of the elements within the customer experience that you need to make sure you have a plan for, and how are we going to do that? And so there could be, in some cases, a different plan for initiate, manage, expand. And then in some cases, you can create it where it is integrated into one plan. So the example I'm going to show you is going to be one that will integrate it because it's a pretty simple version. But there are times where if it's more complex, I might recommend that they get broken out. The other part of it, so once we have that high level, we also then go back to looking at our maturity model. So this is actually an example from Socrata. It was actually a very, very early first draft of a maturity model for open data for government. And they identified their maturity stages as beginner, intermediate, conversational, and then fluent around open data and data publishing. And then what we did is we laid in, okay, how many phases do we think it would really take to deliver on these high value outcomes we've identified to get them from beginner stage to fluent? And at this particular stage, we had identified 3 main phases, and then we built plans that had specific outcomes that we delivered in phase 1, in phase 2, and phase 3. And so from there, we can then start to think about a more detailed plan. So again, I'm keeping us in this same focus. We are in a particular target market. We're looking at the enterprise segment for this sample plan. And again, I won't go through all the details. You'll get these slides. But this is the approach that helps very quickly for the CSMs to start to organize all of those elements we talked about into a very concise plan and approach. And what it is again, we start with a color coding. We needed to be able to identify what kind of a touch, a tech touch, a virtual, or an in-person. And then notice at the top, we have our timeline. This is a first year plan. So the idea is this is tackling onboarding in our first year. And if we have a roadmap where we go from onboarding into phase 2 or phase 3 all within that first year, it would get laid out in this first year plan. We have the months going 1 through 12, and then we have the roadmap stages. So you can see in here, this might be a type of solution where we could go through 4 phases. We've chunked it up pretty short, and we're going to do 4 or 5 key high value outcomes in that first year laid out in our roadmap. And we've also identified that in the maturity level, we're going to be addressing some transformations that get them from maybe they're at a level 1, these particular companies we're going after, and we're going to make sure they get to level 2 and then to level 3 at a minimum by the time we get there, because that's the maturity levels they need to be at in order for us to deliver on those high value outcomes. And so then we can go into the tactics and the types of tasks and or touch points that we want to identify and who's involved. So now between the color coding and the different departments being a collaborative approach, you're able to say, and again, I really dumbed this down. This is very summary level. These would get really blown out to a lot more detail as you build it out. But you might have your onboarding and who's involved between sales, NCS, and services, and how do you want to make that play so it's a great experience for the customer, the transitions are smooth, and the customer is understanding the roadmap because you're spending the time to walk them through it. And then you're going to turn that roadmap over to the services team, let's say for an implementation phase, and the services team is going to generate the first set of high value outcomes, and then the services team might collaborate with the CSM team back into a post-implementation to validate that those values are there, to validate that everything is working, and then if there are things that are falling off track, they create a plan to bring them back on track, and then they continue to start planning for that next phase of the roadmap. Remember, you've laid the roadmap out. The customer knows there's a a next and a next and a next. It's not a one and done. There is a continuous roadmap that's now going to continue to deliver other types of outcomes for them. So you can just see that this continues to go down through even incorporating some of the stages of your customer life cycle, like a value stage or an expansion stage. So this might continue down through that, because your roadmap in this particular case is enterprise. A lot of times they can be a 2-year roadmap. So here would be, if I were going to go into year 2, I would then, obviously, because I'm a little farther out, I would just show quarters, but I would also say that I'd be able to maybe even identify where we would go from here. This might get into, instead of value stages, this might get into expansion stages for a lot of solutions where, okay, we're going to go from this organization to the next organization in the plant, or we're going to go from this process to the next process. So in a case where, let's say, wall to wall for your customers could be, our solution could go across every organization in the company, thinking about HR solutions, things like that. Well, I might start in the marketing department, and then the next part of my roadmap is I'm now going to go to engineering and the product team and go wall to wall there. And then I'm going to go to finance and go wall to wall. Then I'm going to go to sales and I'm going to go wall to wall. Then I'm going to go to services. And that might be your logical roadmap. And in each of those organizations, you are defining those high value problems and outcomes as part of the roadmap. So now you have an evolutionary plan that is taking the customer from one evolution and innovation to the next, with your solution at the center of how they're going to operate. Now you're creating indispensability because you're attaching to those critical business operations. And for them, because every outcome is actually creating these ROIs, you're going to see these ongoing ROIs over time. Now, when we think about the smaller markets, high volume, high tech touches, take all of these same concepts that we just did, they all apply. The difference now is your complexity factor should be really low. So for instance, if you look at your small biz or your mid-market or the lower mid-markets, and you build out this roadmap and you realize the gap is pretty big, it's not that intuitive. If that complexity factor starts to get high, you may not be in a great position for an effective high tech touch program. So you really do have to evaluate for each of these market segments what's going to work. But if you do have a very low complexity factor, you take the same approach we just walked through, you build that out, and then you say, okay, now how do we automate that? How do we create the content? What's the kind of automation we need? And that automation can have automatic startup programs to education paths, and that take them from one step to the next. It can be, all kinds of online self-help, walk yourself through this kind of a roadmap. So you can have an interactive online roadmap. You can have it in your product and get, super sophisticated that way. So there's lots of ways to deliver an automatic roadmap. But instead of just thinking about it more from just a marketing high tech touch, I'm going to just keep throwing data at my customers, make sure it's still intentional. Even if it's in a rotating, repeating to just keep hitting them and make sure they take the next step on their own. Just make sure it's logical and it's still following the roadmap. And if you can use technology, it should also track where they are on the roadmap so that you can be much more intentional about the content that you're delivering at them. Where they are at right now, how do you get them unstuck? And then what do you do to keep them moving to the next phase of that roadmap? And then obviously you want to be able to have a communication plan for getting in front of these people in this market, even with high volumes, using things like regional tours and webinars and user conferences, maybe even having customers, sponsor certain events where you can bring a lot of them together and talk about these issues and challenges and help them to understand by pitching these roadmaps to larger audiences so they still understand the roadmap that leads them to higher values and bigger outcomes so that they can transform their companies and see those real ROIs over time. So with that, I want to share a little bit about how you would evolve these plans. because, you know, the key here is they are not one and done plans. You have a customer roadmap, you have, let's say, a phased or a staged approach, and every one of these is delivering on high value outcomes. You have your customer metrics and your feedbacks always coming in, but those are your guidelines. In the end, your goal is to take all of that and be realistic with your customers on helping them to deliver on their roadmap that you've laid out. And what roadmaps really do for you is it differentiates you in the market as well. You become the thought leader. You become here's how you optimize in this particular market. Here's what we do to make you be able to grow faster, do it more profitably, enhance their own abilities as well that they can offer to their customers. So it's always about creating value in their critical operations of their business so that the renewal happens, the expansion happens because you're taking them from one innovation and one evolution to the next, and you're growing with them over time. So keeping them focused on the roadmap is really the key to creating an effective customer success plan. It isn't, I mean, you are always going to have that element of customers calling you and going, here's all my issues, and here's great. We want to listen. We want to hear what's working and what's not. But then we want to turn around and give them a plan that gets them back on track while addressing their low value issues and tactics and things that they want to cover. So if they come up with low value outcomes, you're like, great, love it. We'll do that. We're going to roll that into our overall plan so that we can deliver on this outcome. And that outcome is the real high value outcome. So again, thinking about being proactive in managing them back to the roadmap. Try not to let the customers lead you to their roadmap, because most of the time that becomes a 50-50 success plan, meaning 50% of the time you're successful and 50% of the time you're failing. So in order to get it more into that 95% and higher range, you want to be very proactive in that roadmap. And then you want to evolve the plans over time. So thinking about the fact that nothing stays the same, our companies change, the market changes. They might have to address the idea of acquiring companies or being even acquired if they decide to do an exit strategy. You having a play in all of those changes is critical to evolving that roadmap to make sure the customer understands you can help them through that. You're still a critical part of their business no matter what's going on in their markets. And so you staying ahead of that and being the thought leader is what will help you to evolve it over time. Always keeping in mind that you want to verify the results, verify their outcomes, verify their ROIs, ask for that information, help them to understand where that information might be and how they can even evaluate that. Creates that automatic business case for renewals and expansions over time. But they will see you as an advisor and a true consultant when you are helping them to deal with business changes and market changes in a phased approach over time. So I know that was a ton of information, but like I said, you'll have the slides, but I'd like to just kind of summarize that the approach I take is I start with that framework, the elements that we went through. And from there, we develop the roadmaps for a target market and for each of the segments, if it does need to change for segments. We do look at maturity models and incorporate them in to understand if there's a high level of transformation or just whatever level of transformation needs to take place. And then once we have those high value outcomes defined that are solving high value problems, it makes it much easier for us to develop the plans off the roadmap. And then we can monitor, we can adjust, we can evolve them over time, and we can then be that proactive partner with them that helps them to adjust to market changes. And that helps us to design every touch point in the customer success plan will be very purposeful. It'll have value. It will guide them to the next more valuable outcome for them, and it will keep them delivering really great results for their own organizations and their own companies. So with that, I would like to open it up to questions and see what I can answer for all of you.
Awesome. Thank you for that presentation, Jackie. So at this time, I'd like to invite the audience to please go ahead and submit your questions. We've had a handful that have already come in. So we will get to those. And let's see, our first question is, and actually this came in this similar type of question in a couple of different formats, but the question is, what are your recommendations on keeping CSMs from being shoved down to a lower level customer contact after the initial sale? The original C-level or VP level decision makers nearly always ignore or refuse to meet with CSMs during QBRs or customer success plan meetings. It's hard to keep strategic alignment when CSMs get pushed down to the lower level folks.
That is a great point.
Recommendations there?
Yeah, there really is. It's where you bring your, if they sold to those stakeholders or that executive level, you have people in your organization that have relationships with those people. And what I've done with my teams is they have an ability, the CSM team has the ability to bring these to bear in weekly meetings to say, I am a customer and I'm stuck at the low level, we can't get up. And we basically use our team to say, who has these relationships? Is it sales? Is it one of our own executives in our company? And they basically get the meeting and they request that they come to a QBR. Or in some cases, if it's just more of timing and just it's hard to get them, we actually would create a separate meeting that we could walk through the roadmaps with them, make sure they're on board, and then go into their team and or middle management people and just basically verify with them, yep, we had this really great conversation, they're on board with this roadmap. But it will enable you to meet them really where they're at. But what you have to do is get to the reason why they're not meeting with you and use your own contacts inside the company, because somebody had meetings with them and somebody sold this person somewhere. So they might have the ability to break down those walls and get you the meetings. It may not be in your QBR, so don't be stuck with they're not attending the QBR. Maybe you need to create a one-on-one type session with them outside of that meets them where, because their schedules sometimes are very difficult to get them. And I've found when I actually talk to the executives, they're not intentionally not wanting to be there. They just can't ever fit those in. And if you're trying to get an audience of 10 or 15 people, it doesn't always meet your executive sponsor's schedules very well. So I would go at it at a couple of different ways, but definitely use your connections inside who already have relationships.
I think it's a great recommendation. Our next question is, what do you do if you uncover a disconnect in expectations from the customer side in regards to the customer success plan?
Again, with the roadmap, so if they've never, this happens a lot where, in the sales cycle, you're dealing with a different group of people. So they might have even seen the initial roadmap and plan, and they all agree to it. And then they handed it to a team, and you might be walking into that team who's like, yeah, I don't get it, but here's what I need to do. We always start all of our sessions with, we want you to understand the roadmap that we designed for you, and then we name all the people that have seen the roadmap, that are on board with the roadmap. And we want to take the time to walk you all through it so that you understand what we shared with your executive team and your leadership team and what they bought into and how we're going to help you transform. And that then brings them into the loop because you're addressing it right up front, whether you do that in your kickoff meeting, in your design sessions. You want to bring them into the fold by basically walking them through that all over again. And it is a common problem. I'll walk in and they dive right into the details, and the team is looking around the table going, I don't even know why we're here, what we're doing, we don't even know why they bought you. And so you need to bring them into the fold right off the bat. That's part of that customer experience that you create with your life cycle, is that it's a nice transition from sales over to services to the CSM team, and that they're introducing the players from the leadership team down to the actual working team, and that you can even have sales help position that roadmap and reintroduce it to the next layer of people that are coming into the plan with you for execution.
That's great. Our next question is, can you explain further what you meant by maturity levels?
I can. So the maturity levels of every company is, if you think about, like I said, a startup. Startups will tackle all problems when something really is critical. It becomes all hands on deck all the time, but that's not scalable. So over time, they start to organize. They start to create coordinated attacks, if you will. They start to divide and conquer. They start to create standards and policies and processes for how to collaborate across the organizations, but be able to handle more customers in a more intentional, standardized approach, which means you start being aware that you need specific levels of service and or experience with your customers that you want to deliver 10 out of 10 times. So you want to start to standardize that experience, and you want people to do things the same way. That's part of the maturity of a company, that you start to put these standards and processes in place over time, and these procedures and policies that you all agree to across all of your organizations, so you could deliver success to customers in a consistent, quality, excellence, very proactive manner. And so as you go from one level to the next, you're putting these standards and processes in place. You're then collecting data. You're able to use data to figure out what's working, what's not. You're able to shift and make changes in your organization a little bit more, not just quickly, but more intentionally, more purposeful. And then you'll get to a point where you have enough data, enough standards, enough consistency with what you deliver on, that you're going to start to be able to predict your results in the market and your ability to deliver products and services in a very standardized, purposeful way that your customers start talking about, like every time they deal with you, they get the same results. It's high quality, it's excellence. So maturity models in an industry are identifying companies in the industry and different maturity levels those companies are at.
Perfect. Thank you for explaining that a little bit more. Our next question is, what stage in the life cycle do clients typically struggle, and what preemptive strategies do you have in place to prevent that?
Probably the biggest challenge in customer lifecycle model is what I call the coordinated attack. I think people get really comfortable in each of their own organizations on what they can do and how they do it. But the transition from a customer perspective from one to the other is the areas that I probably spend the most time helping them to create a more coordinated effort for collaborating together and transitioning the customer throughout the life cycle for different areas of services that they need to solve their problems and to keep them moving forward. And so I spend more time on those transitions, as well as to not be disruptive across the organizations. Because again, when you're a less mature company, your way of dealing with the problem is you just run over to the person and go, okay, we have this. And so everybody's being very disruptive to each other, instead of creating some kind of standardized approaches for how we will deal with all these different scenarios that come up with our customers in a very organized manner that creates a really good experience for the customer, but isn't quite so disruptive for the company. And so we develop those together and get agreement, and this is our standard approach now. And then we just allow for flexibility, meaning if the wheels fall off, here's what we're going to do, kind of in case of emergency, do this, 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 and this. But it will create a more collaborative approach. But those are always the challenges in customer lifecycle models. I think people build these great, journey maps out and great intention, and everybody does theirs really well. But it's those handoffs and those transitional periods, as well as the collaborative approaches, that you need to spend a little bit more time on and get agreement across the organizations. But that's how you solve it, is getting agreement across the organization that this is how we're going to work together when this happens at the customer.
That's great advice. Our next question is, what do you do when customers don't necessarily want to put in the effort to measure the quantitative benefits of the product? Is there any way to measure it without involving the customer or giving them quote unquote homework?
Well, keep in mind that if they've signed up for your roadmap to deliver on some high value outcomes, in the very beginning, we usually will lay out how we're gonna, how do we know we're successful? And so if they are avoiding that, we usually will also bring in and or go back to our key sponsors and the people that were expecting this kind of outcomes to see what we can do to help it make it easier for them to provide us that information so that we know that we are on track in delivering to these outcomes. And it's rare that you'll get a lot of pushback if you can keep the some of the key leadership people involved, whether that's through the way that you deliver on your reporting, your status updates, your email campaigns, things that you want to make sure they're aware of that's going on in their markets. However you want to deliver valuable content, you keep those leaders in the loop and part of that communication on an ongoing basis so that you can tap into them when you get roadblocked, whether that's hidden agendas on different customer teams' parts. But you always want to make sure that you have those relationships, that sales make sure that you are introduced to all of those key players, that you build those relationships and keep them so that you can tap into them when you need them. And it's usually where you get stuck down at the user level, and somehow no one ever helped you to get introduced and be able to build relationships with some of the key people that were sold in the beginning, that start to roadblock you from not being able to get to the people that you need to get that information. Most of them are very happy to understand that. And the only difference would be is, I always make it, hey, this can be totally private. We're not even going to use it if you don't want us to, or publish it. We just want to track it to make sure we're delivering on this roadmap that we agreed to. And that is usually what will help them also maybe not be so sensitive to giving you that information. Sometimes they think that you're just out for a marketing case study kind of thing, and sometimes get a little shy of sharing that information. So you can also tell them that you wouldn't do that. You can keep it really private between them.
Yeah, I think that's great advice for getting the customer on board. I think we have time for one last question, and that is, creating an individual life cycle for each customer seems like a lot of effort. What do you suggest for CSMs that have 100 plus client accounts they manage?
So a customer lifecycle model is built for a company, not a customer. And for a lot of companies, it's only one customer lifecycle model. The only time it might change is if in their go-to-market strategy, they're going after multiple markets. So for instance, we have a solution for financial services, and we also have a solution for retail, or we have a solution for engineering organizations and a solution for marketing. There's usually one customer lifecycle model. The roadmaps then get developed. Remember, you're using the 80-20 rule. So if that market has, tens of thousands of potential customers for you, you're developing a roadmap, one roadmap for that market that is the 80-20 rule. So for the majority of that market, these are the problems we solve. Here's the high value outcomes. And that then allows you that if you do have thousands of customers, you can then do a high tech touch to hundreds following that roadmap. So the only thing that you do with roadmaps when you get to the upper mid-market and enterprise, and the only reason why you might be more customized and specific is because the problems you're solving are more complex, and therefore there might need to be some flexibility in that roadmap to address some very specific needs for those high-end enterprise customers. But you're still going after the 80-20 rule of the really big problems. So hopefully that helped to clarify that. It's not your customer success. You can actually create a customer success plan for thousands of customers in a target market in a segment, and you can deliver a tech touch automation that is delivering the right content on that.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for making that clarification. So that brings us at the top of the hour, and I did want to remind everyone again that we did record this session, and we will be sending out the follow-up emails tomorrow. And at the end of this webcast, you'll see a survey pop up. We'd appreciate if you would take a minute or two before logging off just to complete the survey to provide your feedback. And thanks again, Jackie, and thanks to everyone for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.